James knew the moment he stepped into that alley that things would never be the same. The acid, stolen from the hands of a black military general, wasn't just a weapon. It was a message, a way to make the system feel the weight of its own hypocrisy. But when it hit the officer's face, burning through his skin like nothing he'd ever seen, James realized the real shock was still to come. What he did next, it'll leave even the most hardened skeptics speechless. But let's start at the beginning. James stood at the edge of the alley, hidden in the shadows, his breath steady but quick. The night air felt cool against his skin, the kind of chill that ran deeper than just the temperature. He had seen so many things before, too many things, but this one felt different. The cop, a weathered man in his mid-40s, moved slowly toward the container with the kind of self-assurance that only someone blind to the truth could have. The officer's black hair, streaked with gray, stuck out from under his cap, his face carved with lines of experience and the hardened stare of a man who had long since stopped questioning what he did. His uniform was neat, the brass buttons gleaming, a symbol of authority. But beneath that surface, there was an ignorance, one James had seen in far too many officers over the years. The officer reached for the container, his fingers brushing across the cool metal, and James could feel the tension coiling in the air. It wasn't just any chemical solution inside that container. James knew what it was. It had been taken from General Taylor's private stash, liquid that had been passed down through generations of black military leaders, a substance known for its corrosive power. James had seen it burn through metal, plastic, even skin. But this wasn't about the acid. This wasn't about the burn. This was about a message. The cop didn't know it yet, but this was a signal, a way for the powers that be to understand just how far the system's corruption had spread. This was a moment that would change everything. "What's this? Another damn mess?" the officer muttered, his voice low and gruff as he squinted at the container. His words were laced with annoyance, as if the object in front of him were just another nuisance in his mundane day. But James knew the officer was getting too close to something much bigger than him. As the cop leaned in further, examining the container with the intensity of a man too deep into his job to ever question it, James felt his heartbeat match the officer's pace. He could feel the pressure building, an urge to act, but he forced himself to stay still. Not yet. He needed the officer to get closer, to see him more clearly, to truly understand what was happening. James stepped forward silently, barely making a sound, his every movement deliberate, calculating. The cop, oblivious to the danger, leaned in just a little too far. He ran his fingers across the top of the container, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. But he still had no clue what he was dealing with. He was too focused on the immediate, on the simple fact of what was in front of him, rather than the deep layers beneath it. James could almost hear the man's thoughts. "What the hell is this? And why does it smell so damn strong?" But that didn't matter now. The moment had arrived. James's chest tightened, and in that heartbeat, he knew. This was the beginning of something he couldn't turn back from. His hand slid into his jacket pocket, and he pulled out the device, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. It was now or never. The liquid inside the container wasn't just a chemical. It was about to become the catalyst for everything that was coming next. The moment the officer's hand brushed the liquid, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. A violent hiss filled the air, followed by a sharp, wet splash. The liquid, a corrosive, almost glowing substance, leapt out of the container and hit the officer's face, splattering with a sickening sound. The cop's eyes widened in shock, his hand instinctively coming up to shield his face, but it was already too late. His skin reacted instantly. It bubbled up, rippling and swelling like molten lava, the flesh writhing in grotesque patterns as the acid ate through his skin. The officer's body jerked, as if he were caught in some twisted dance, his mouth opening in a silent scream that broke into a terrible, guttural howl. The pain was unbearable. His skin seemed to liquefy, the once pristine face, now a sickening mess of raw, burned tissue. His uniform caught the acid as well, the fabric darkening and disintegrating in moments. The officer stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he fell to the ground, his back arching in agony. His hands scrambled against the dirt, trying to push himself away from the pain, but it was everywhere. It didn't stop. His face, his entire face, was a horrific map of destruction. He rolled on the ground, eyes wide and filled with terror, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The very thing he had reached for had turned on him, a monstrous reversal of power. But James didn't flinch. He'd seen this before. He had watched how the system chewed up people like the officer, people who lived their lives in blind compliance to rules that always favored them, that protected them. The officer's pain didn't move him. It didn't make him feel sorry, and it definitely didn't make him hesitate. It was the system that James was focused on. The officer was just a casualty of it, a part of something much larger and far more dangerous. James stepped back into the shadows, calmly pulling his phone out of his pocket. He switched on the camera, the lens focusing as the officer continued to writhe in the dirt. There was no rush. The world needed to see this, needed to understand how far the system would go to hurt the very people it was supposed to protect. This wasn't just about one man's suffering. This was about showing how broken it all was. James clicked the record button, the phone capturing the chaos. The officer's screams now a shrill soundtrack to the unfolding nightmare. "Help me!" The officer's voice cracked, pleading, his words barely intelligible as he fumbled at his face, trying to wipe away the acid that wasn't just eating him alive. It was undoing everything he thought he stood for. He tried to scream again, but all that came out was a choking sob. But there was no help coming. Not for him, not for the system, not anymore. James knew this was bigger than any one person. The camera kept rolling, and the world would soon see what had been hidden for so long. The truth had finally been exposed, and there was no turning back from it. Within minutes, the scene was flooded with backup officers, but they weren't looking for answers. They were looking for someone to blame. And they found James. They grabbed him, dragged him to the ground as his camera slipped from his hand. "You're the one who did this," one officer growled, pulling his arm behind his back with more force than necessary. But James didn't flinch. He stood there, cold as the night air, as the officers shouted at him. He knew what was coming. He knew they'd twist the story, make him the villain, and the officer the victim. But he also knew he had something they didn't: the truth. "Get the hell off me," James growled, struggling against their grip. This is what happens when you start playing with fire. And then he saw it. His phone, the footage still running. The truth, caught in real time, streaming live to thousands of eyes. The officers froze when they realized they were on camera. Hours later, the department was in full damage control mode, trying to spin the narrative and sweep the mess under the rug. But the truth was already out. The footage went viral, the officers' screams echoing across social media like a wake-up call to the nation. People were talking, and not just about the acid, but about the system that allowed it to happen. As the general's secret liquid made its way into the public eye, the officer who'd been hurt was no longer the victim. The world saw him for what he was, a product of a broken system, a system that had failed countless times before. James didn't need their apology. He didn't need the system to fix itself. What mattered was that the truth was now undeniable, and for the first time, the scales tipped in his favor.